Last week's episode, I said this.
Well, the first person, by the way, I want to put on my list here is I want to put Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson would sit right here. Tucker Carlson is himself a serious Christian. He understands the intellectual roots and origins of conservatism. This is where he finds himself.
I was wrong. Tucker Carlson is buying into, unwittingly, the left's narrative regarding the West, that the West was actually really quite wicked. We were the bad guys in World War II, not the Germans, not Japan. He even goes on to suggest in their discussion here that Stalin, maybe he wasn't the guy that we've all been told that he was. I put Tucker Carlson at the center of my bullseye, where I am talking about what represents authentic conservatism and what doesn't. And welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton. And today we are discussing historical truth, narratives, and the way they are created. Now, on last week's episode, I said this.
Well, the first person, by the way, I want to put on my list here is I want to put Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson would sit right here, I think. Tucker Carlson is himself a serious Christian. He understands the intellectual roots and origins of conservatism. This is where he finds himself.
I was wrong. I put Tucker Carlson at the center of my bullseye, where I am talking about what represents authentic conservatism and what doesn't. And it's interesting because we had recorded that a couple of weeks ago, and then we released it on the morning, the same day that Tucker Carlson released a podcast. Unfortunate for me. So, here I am saying Tucker Carlson is kind of the anchor of authentic conservatism. And the same day, he releases a podcast where he is interviewing a revisionist historian by the name of Daryl Cooper. And in that interviewer, Cooper is he's a podcaster, apparently a popular podcaster, for reasons that I think will become evident because he makes all kinds of outlandish claims, and he does it with a kind of authority that suggests he really knows the truth. He really knows the truth, and he prides himself on having a dispassionate view of history, that he's presenting both sides. He's getting into the heads of both sides of whatever issue is being discussed. Now, I think this is a very flawed approach, and I think that Cooper is not a good historian. But that podcast was released the same day that I put Tucker Carlson at the center of my bullseye. And I have no problem with Tucker Carlson or anyone else, me, for instance, platforming people who have ideas, academic or otherwise, that are outside of the mainstream or even a bit bizarre. But if you do it, you must be able to recognize the manner in which their ideas are bizarre, not only for yourself, but for your audience, because presumably your audience, at least most of them, they watch your show because they trust you. They trust your opinion. They want to know what you have to say. And if you sit idly by while someone is making outrageous claims and you nod and you seem to give your consent to what's being said, which Carlson does verbally and otherwise, your audience comes away thinking that the outlandish claims themselves are true. It is why, for instance, if I were to I wouldn't have a medical expert on Ideas Have Consequences who was known for making outlandish claims. And the reason is because I don't possess the expertise in that field to be able to identify the outlandish claims, meaning the guest could probably get away with an awful lot. So if you're going to have somebody like that on your show, it needs to be in a field where you're conversant, or you have someone else on who is conversant in that field who can then challenge those ideas, you see. So that is important. So what kind of outlandish claims did Daryl Cooper make? Well, he made them concerning the Holocaust. He made them concerning Winston Churchill. He made them concerning Adolf Hitler, and he made them concerning historical narratives in general. Now, listen to this, just by way of a teaser. We're going to get into this in more detail, but listen to this little morsel, this little gem right here.
But I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland.
Let me repeat. He says, and I quote, Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, that's quite a claim. That is quite a claim, but it gets worse. And all the more so because Carlson never challenges the claims. Quite the opposite. He laps it all up. He calls Cooper, and I quote, the best and most honest popular historian in the United States, which is laughable. Unsurprisingly, and perhaps deliberately, controversy ensued and social media exploded from people who are listening to this all across the ideological spectrum. Now, I was talking to a very good friend of mine in media who hadn't seen this. And I said, have you seen this interview where this guy calls, Churchill the chief villain of the Second World War? He seeks to undermine the Holocaust. Have you seen it? He said, no, I haven't seen it. And I said, well, it's problematic because this gives a headshot to the left on conservatism. And his response was, understandably, well, the left lies about us all the time. And I said, yes, but in this case, they wouldn't be lying. They would be quoting Tucker Carlson, who many consider to be, again, a representative of thoughtful conservatism, sitting by and nodding his head and endorsing a historian who is undermining the entire Western narrative. Now, again, Carlson's defenders will say, oh, you're just beholden to a history and you don't like it being questioned. No, you're allowed to question it. I don't mind you questioning it. I have no problem with you questioning my belief in God, with what I believe concerning Winston Churchill, or what I can believe concerning the founding of the United States. But you better bring your facts. You better bring your facts. You see, in historical scholarship, you are allowed to make extraordinary claims, but you must have extraordinary evidence. And let me give you a little example of what I'm talking about. When I was a young graduate student, I was working with a guy who had fought in World War II under the command of George Patton. He was an interesting guy, didn't strike me as a sensationalist at all, but I was a security guard at night. I was like the Maytag man, just sitting around, all night long. I worked from 6 p.m. To 6 a.m., and then I would go to class. It was absolutely miserable. But one of the things that made it nice was I would sit and listen to this old man who, in his retirement, had taken this job part-time just to keep himself busy. And he would talk about his experiences in the Second World War. And I was understandably fascinated. And then one day, he very casually said something that blew me away. We all have two ages, our true age and our biological age. Our bio age suggests how healthy or unhealthy we are inside. You want your bio-age years younger than your true age. Let me tell you how Field of Greens is helping me to do that. A medical test can reveal your body's biological age, which can show if you're aging prematurely. Better nutrition has always shown to reverse one's bio-age. My hope in living longer and healthier is why I take Field of Greens. Field of Greens is an organic superfood, fruit, and vegetable drink unlike any other. It's serious nutrition. Listen to this. Field of Greens was approved for a university study that doctors believe may lower your body's biological age. That generally means better health. Each fruit and vegetable in Field of Greens was selected by doctors to support vital body functions like heart, liver, kidneys, metabolism, and immune system. Only Field of Greens is backed by the Better Health Promise. At your next physical or checkup, your doctor will notice your improved health or your money back. Join me in Better Health with 15% off and free shipping. Visit fieldofgreens.com and use promo code IDEAS. That's promo code IDEAS at fieldofgreens.com. That's fieldofgreens.com. He told the story, a very famous story that some of you will be familiar with, that is in the movie Patton, that Patton had come into an army hospital and there was a soldier there. Some of you will remember this, that there was a soldier there who was shell-shocked and he was weeping, and Patton asked him what was wrong with him, and he said he couldn't take it anymore, and the war was really getting on his nerves, and Patton famously slapped him and told him to be a man, and that he was a disgrace to the Army to be sitting in a place like this with men who had been wounded in battle when there had been nothing that had actually happened to him. Now, the result of that was, it may sound like a small incident, but the result of that particular episode changed the course of history, and that is because Patton was fired as commander of, I think it was 7th Army, doesn't matter, I'm just going off the top of my head here. He lost his command, and it appeared that he might not ever get another command. Of course, he ended up in Normandy. After the landing, he assumed command of 3rd Army, I think, and the rest is history. But that particular episode is a very, very famous episode. Now, this older gentleman was telling me that he was there for that event. He was in the hospital, and he said, what you're hearing from the history books and the movies is a lie. He said the man wasn't shell-shocked. He told Patton, he was chuckling. He said, I've got a case of the clap. That is to say, VD, that he had picked up from some local girls. And that Patton was outraged that a man who had venereal disease was being treated in a hospital, removed from combat, and being treated in a hospital with men who'd been wounded in battle, and that Patton lost it. I thought, wow. Again, I'm a young budding historian, and I'm thinking to myself, this could be a fascinating thesis. But you know, I never published it. And you know why I never published it? Because it was an extraordinary claim that went against the mountain of scholarship that said something quite different. Now, that doesn't mean you can't challenge historical narratives, even reigning historical paradigms. But if you're going to do it, you have to prove it. You have to prove it. You don't get to just say, well, Churchill was the chief victim of the Second World War. Okay, prove it. Bring the receipts. And Cooper never does. He never offers any evidence for his claims. Now, again, I understand this is a podcast. He's not going to whip out a bibliography and cite all of his primary sources, but you got to cite something. Something that's authentic, something that's real, some kind of bedrock evidence that those of us who are listening can go and verify. And he never does. And again, coming back to my story about the soldier who my late night security guard, Maytag man colleague said, it may have been true, but I had no means of getting the medical records of the soldier. I could find his name, but I had no means of getting the medical records of the soldier in question without the permission of the family. You see, that's the way those kind of records work. And without the knowledge of who else was in that hospital at that time, or even if any of them were alive, I couldn't go and interview them to see if others had a similar, could verify my colleague's claim. And let me tell you, I would have loved to have been able to do so, because here you are, again, as a 20-something graduate student in history, and you're part of your responsibility in writing your thesis and your dissertation is that it must be, and I quote, unique and original. Unique and original. You need to be writing about something that is a unique contribution to the field. You don't just get to say what everyone else has already said, which is part of the problem here. Because what Cooper maintains, and Carlson with him, which to me is incredible, is that they're both saying you're not allowed to question these narratives. Daryl Cooper, you were doing it on arguably the biggest podcast in the world. You don't get to claim that you're not allowed to question narratives when you're on a podcast that's being listened to by millions. That's a ridiculous assertion. Who is stopping you? What government operatives are trying to prevent you from saying that? And as I will indicate in this episode, the narrative you're pushing, Tucker and Cooper, is the government narrative. It's the left's narrative. You're acting like questioning, undermining the Holocaust, Winston Churchill, the West in the Second World War, the Allies in the Second World War. You're acting like those are narratives you're not allowed to question. The left loves to question them because they want to undermine the moral authority of the West. What was Obama's first act as president of the United States? I did a podcast on this. Do you remember? It was the removal of the bust, the small statuette of Winston Churchill. It was his first act. He removed it from the Oval Office, get rid of it. The British had given it to the United States as a gift. But Obama didn't want it. Dinesh D'Souza has written about this in The Roots of Obama's Rage, which is an excellent book. I appear in the acknowledgments. Now, why doesn't Obama like Churchill? Because Churchill is part of the bedrock of the modern Western, not just British, but Western narrative and moral authority, all of which he hates, and the left hates. And Tucker Carlson, who I mistakenly put as the, at the center of what authentic conservatism is, unwittingly embraced in this podcast the left's whole narrative. They love the destruction of Churchill. That's the next statue to go in Britain. The woke mob wants to get rid of Churchill. They hate Winston Churchill. And they would love to suggest that the West, that the Allies were just as villainous as the Axis powers, as Italy, Germany, and Japan. They would love to highlight at every turn any atrocity or to create atrocities. And that's what Tucker Carlson was embracing on this episode. Now, why was he doing it? Now, I don't think that Carlson was doing it, as some might allege, because he's an anti-Semite or because he hates the West. He clearly does not. He's a patriot. He loves the United States. I think he's done it because he didn't know any better. He was not knowledgeable enough to push back at what Cooper was saying. And by the way, Cooper, who has blocked me on social media, go and read what he has to say about God. Go and read what he has to say about the Old Testament. The guy it's like reading Richard Dawkins. So there's something else that's going on with this guy. Cooper is not a conservative. And Tucker Carlson, at least in this podcast, embraces views unwittingly that are definitely not conservative, but they're also just not historically accurate. And that's highly, highly problematic. Now, again, I don't have a problem I'm not in favor of censorship. Let the whack job speak. But there needs to be rebuttal. There needs to be people who push back at what is being alleged, at what is being said. That's incredibly important. And by the way, Carlson, in spite of the claims from the left, from Democrats, that he just, he never questioned Putin when he did the interview with Putin. I thought he put some tough questions to Putin. But you also got to bear in mind that in that particular interview, he's in the Kremlin. I mean, he's not at a neutral site. So Carlson had a very difficult task on that occasion. I don't think you want to provoke Putin when you're sitting in his house and when the interview itself isn't live and when they can revoke your visa and put you in jail. So I think Carlson was fairly careful in that interview. But he did ask Putin some tough questions. He did refute some of the narrative, and he did push back. He never does in this one. On the contrary, he just laps it all up. And I found this particularly incredible that he would do so. Now, again, what is the motive here? Well, a cynical reading of it would be that it's to sell books and get clicks. And I do think that is part of the motive. If Carlson had on, for instance, and we will later in this episode, I will interview a Paul Reid, who is a friend of mine, colleague. If you're familiar with the trilogy, the wonderful trilogy, The Last Line, one of the most popular, best-selling Churchill biographies of all time, authored by William Manchester, the late William Manchester, and Paul Reid, who will join us on the show. If you have him on Tucker Carlson's podcast, maybe that's not as exciting because what Reid is going to say falls in the mainstream of scholarship regarding Churchill. But if you have on a guy who says, you know what, Abraham Lincoln was a cross-dresser, well, that might get clicks. I mean, here we are, for instance, talking about Carlson's interview with Cooper. So maybe the strategy has worked. So one could say that this is all just some kind of clickbait, that this is just an effort to sell books, to grow Carlson's podcast. But in a worst case scenario, the purpose here, not by Carlson, by the way, because again, I just don't believe that this is what motivates Carlson, but it is an attempt to undermine the West's moral authority. And we'll take a look at some of the other claims that this guy makes. But let's just start with the idea that Winston Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, it's all I can do. Now, I'll try to be kind in responding to this. But let's think about this for just 1 second. Hitler's Mein Kampf was published in 1925. Now, I have read it, and I would suggest that you read it too. The left doesn't want you to read books. You need to read books, and I'll probably drop a thread sometime soon on evil books you should read. Now, I say you should read them. You should read them if you're knowledgeable enough, educated enough in these areas, or have someone who can guide you in what you're reading, so that you don't just accept it all as true. Again, this is not to speak down to anyone. If I were reading a book on some kind of extraordinary medical claims, I might not have the wherewithal, probably wouldn't, to know whether what is being said is true or not. So I would go to a physician friend of mine or someone in a research field to say to me, that I could ask them, is this true? And they could say to me, well, actually, no, you should probably go and read this book right here, or yes, this is, however, and they could offer me some context to that. So I don't want to send you in the direction of reading evil books and the result of that be to unhinge you. But Mein Kampf was published in 1925. Now, that's 15 years before Winston Churchill became prime minister. 15 years. And it is Hitler's screed, rant, a kind of manifesto in which he states in bald-faced terms what his agenda will be should he ever gain power. Now, he did gain power in 1933. He became German chancellor in 1933. And in 1936, he invaded or occupied the Rhineland. In 1938, the Sudetenland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. In 1939, he invaded Poland. In April of 1940, Denmark and Norway. And on May 10 of 1940, he invaded Benelux and France. And on that same day, May 10 of 1940, Neville Chamberlain resigns and Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister of the UK. Now, how in the world can you say that Winston Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War when he wasn't even Prime Minister during all of these invasions? Cooper says, as in the interview, that Churchill was responsible for it becoming a war that was anything other than an invasion of Poland. Cooper, it was already something other than Poland. Did you not just listen to the inventory of territories, countries that Hitler invaded? And to speak as though Poland is nothing. It's Churchill's responsibility. It became anything other than an invasion of Poland. Does Poland not matter? Poland was subdivided by Hitler and Stalin, partitioned, cut in half. And both sides were annihilating wholesale populations. Look up the Katyn Forest Massacre. See what happened in Warsaw. I think they matter. I think they matter. But in his telling of it, Churchill was a warmonger. This, by the way, was the argument of the opposition party in Britain at the time, or at least at the end of the war, that Churchill was a warmonger. And this guy buys into it and he presents it, and he kind of suggests that Hitler really wasn't all that bad a guy. He was just some sort of statesman who really wanted peace. It's pretty incredible. But all of this had happened before Churchill became prime minister. And by the way, you probably haven't heard about this in mainstream media yet. The U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar are on the brink of collapse on multiple fronts. The U.S. dollar is being pummeled, and it could collapse in the fall of 2024, this year, leading to a depression that we haven't seen before. Although major news outlets and current Federal Reserve policymakers have been upbeat on the economy and say inflation is nearing the Fed's target, Americans' wallets are still being pinched due to the extreme high prices, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain a comfortable standard of living. It's no surprise the U.S. household debt skyrocketed above $17 trillion. The current economic environment has caused Americans to borrow at a rate we've never seen in our history. The Great American Debt Crisis could spark a major economic downturn far worse than the Great Financial Crisis. The labor market is starting to cool, and major U.S. banks such as Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan say the markets are indicating a higher chance of our country entering a recession. It's no wonder why some Americans are bracing for the worst. Imagine what happens next. Hyperinflation, skyrocketing prices, and a recession that could last for years to come. And all of this could happen after November this year. Your purchasing power could plummet even further, and ultimately this could lead to the collapse of the U.S. dollar, leaving you struggling to afford the bare necessities. We've already seen food prices rise by more than 25% since November of 2020. If the US dollar collapses, that could push more Americans into poverty and lead to social unrest. The worst part, the government won't protect Americans' wallets or bail out Americans. It's on you to safeguard your assets in retirement and secure your future. Given the timely nature of this news, it's of the utmost importance for you to click the link below to get Monetary Gold's complimentary asset protection guide. Inside, you'll discover exactly why the US dollar may collapse from debt by the fall of 2024 and how to prepare for a collapsing economy. You'll also learn about an IRS loophole that you could save thousands of dollars in taxes by using. Do not miss out on the opportunity to safeguard your assets now, because in the coming weeks, it may be too late. Call now at 800-888-2151. That's 800-888-2151. England was being bombed by Germany. I think that's significant. But he goes on to say this.
He wanted to go out there and like prove that he's the warlord that can go out there and fight this big war. Probably. I think part of it, I read about Churchill and he strikes me as a psychopath. But he's also a sort of, he was a drunk. He was very childish in strange ways.
Again, another extraordinary claim. I know of no other credible historian who makes the claim that Churchill was a psychopath. But again, you can make the claim, but you got to bring the receipts. Who says that? Was there, this is a clinical diagnosis. What's your evidence for that? Because he played with toy soldiers? This actually has a long tradition among military men of setting up. In fact, I just watched a Columbo episode where a general is setting up, his Gettysburg. He's recreating it. There's an old tradition of this, but Cooper doesn't seem to know this. Then he says this.
Themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler is chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that. And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead there. You have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now?
Now, this is where he's particularly devious. He doesn't say Holocaust. He does acknowledge that millions of people died. It's a very subtle undermining of the Holocaust narrative that is intended to exonerate the Germans, the Nazis. This was all just a mistake, a logistical mistake. They just weren't prepared for the millions of prisoners that they were going to have. Ladies and gentlemen, when Hitler's armies launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd, 1941, 175 divisions, 4.5 million men pouring into the East. I promise you, they were expecting lots of prisoners. Lots of them. And again, Mein Kampf had been written 16 years earlier, in which he said what he planned to do in the East, something called Lebensraum, elbow room. We're going to create for ourselves more land. We're going to eliminate our enemy in the East, a threat to the East, and we're going to create room for the German people. We're going to get rid of the Slavs and the Jews. We will exterminate them. This wasn't a mistake. The Einsatzgruppen units went in with the Wehrmacht, behind them, with the intention of exterminating wholesale these people. That was the program. That was the plan. What is Cooper's evidence for this claim? Again, another extraordinary claim. And I stress, you're allowed to make extraordinary claims, but you have to back them up. And occasionally historians do make extraordinary claims and do back them up. And suddenly a new field of scholarship is opened up. And we discover, wow, this is something that we didn't know. But you got to prove it. You know what his evidence is here? He says, we have letters. We have letters, unspecified letters. I don't care if you have some letters. That doesn't prove anything. The mountain of scholarship runs contrary to any such claims. And by the way, there would be German generals. We should make some distinction between, let's say, the Wehrmacht and the Einsatzgruppen, because some German generals would not necessarily, at least at this point, be fully knowledgeable of what the program was. So sure, somebody might have written a letter and said, we can't feed all these people. Maybe the more humane thing to do is to put them down. But is that humane? I mean, Cooper seems to think it is. Killing millions of people, putting them in gas chambers was humane. And again, Carlson just sits there and goes, yeah. The most honest, objective, best historian in the United States. This is what he says. You would have thought that at some point Carlson would have interrupted and said, now hold on just a second there, Daryl. You've just said that Churchill is the chief villain of World War II. Now that goes against pretty much everything that has been written. No credible historian takes this view. None of the evidence that I'm familiar with takes this view. And you've also said that he is a villain and that the Holocaust was simply a logistical mistake. Now, you're going to have to prove that on this show. Offer us your evidence. You have the floor. But he never does. He never does that. So Cooper gets away with making the claim. Now, at some point, Cooper says, by inference, and part of what I want you to learn today on this episode is how truth is often undermined subtly through inference. It's just through inference. Cooper is too clever to give you the line, the Holocaust didn't happen. It's a lie. He never says that. He's much too devious for that. Instead, he just chips away at the narrative and offers a kind of justification to the Germans that this was all just a mistake. We didn't mean to kill millions of people. Now, that's an incredible thing to say. Now, I have noticed an incredible growing anti-Semitic trend all over social media. And you'll see some of it after this episode airs. Maybe it would take place in the chat, the live chat of anti-Semitism there. Now, why is that? Why are we seeing this rise in anti-Semitism? Why all of a sudden is there so much interest in the Holocaust? Well, there's a reason for that. Anytime the past is being rewritten, and by the way, tyrants and would-be tyrants are always rewriting the history. They want control of history because they can use it to justify a modern agenda. That's what has been done on all the figures whose statues are being toppled all over the Western world. Tucker Carlson has given unwittingly justification for the toppling of every Winston Churchill and by inference FDR statue that was ever raised. They just as well get out there and start pushing them over themselves. But why it's happening right now, why there is suddenly this interest in the Second World War, is because there is an interest in the Holocaust. And why is there interest in the Holocaust? To undermine the state of Israel's moral authority for its existence. Now, ladies and gentlemen, two things can be true at once. You can acknowledge the fact, and it is a fact, of the Holocaust, while still not agreeing with every decision of the state of Israel. That the Holocaust happened does not make Israel infallible in every decision it should make. But you see, why someone like a Candace Owens is interested in the Holocaust is because she wants to undermine Israel's moral authority in its current struggle for its very existence. That's what she's doing. I've been interested in the Second World War because I want to learn. I have an academic interest in the Second World War, not to justify any current agendas. But when things like this, when these kind of claims are made, I'm going to come after you and push you to prove it. What is implied in what Cooper says, again, in saying you're not allowed to question these narratives, that's idiocy. These narratives are questioned all the time. Best-selling books are written by questioning the narratives because they get outside of the mainstream of what other scholars are saying. And the way to make a name for yourself is to make an outrageous claim. Those are the books that sell. It's true. What Cooper and Carlson are implying is that the Western narrative is created by governments. That suggests that every historian who has written on these topics, that they were controlled, they were guided by some kind of government agency. Ladies and gentlemen, that's crazy talk. That's the kind of stuff that would happen now. That's where we're going now. Books are being burnt, as I've told you, electronically all over the place now. A guy like me has a hard time getting, I used to write for all kinds of publications. And I always tried to write for ones on the left. It's funny to me that people go on social media and say, you wrote for the Atlantic, you wrote for, the New York Post, or whatever. I'm not going to listen to what you have to say. I would write all day long for the New York Times if I could, because that's the audience I want to reach. Those are the people whose minds I want to change. But you see, beginning in about 2016 with the election of Trump, it became almost impossible for guys like me, your token conservative, to publish in places like USA Today. These started becoming very difficult with Fox News. Hence the reason that many of us ended up doing podcasts, because we had a hard time finding places to publish anymore. Meaning there's massive censorship that is going on now. But not then. When books like this were written, there wasn't any such censorship that was going on. No, none of the books that I wrote were censored. None of the historians that I know who were publishing on the Western narrative were censored or controlled. And to imply it is crazy talk. That's Area 54 kind of stuff. It just simply isn't true. Now, has it happened in other parts of the world? Yes. In China, in Russia, and even in Germany. A scholar by the name of Fritz Fischer famously wrote a book called Germany's Aims in the First World War, and he wanted to go speak in the West, and the government tried to block him from doing it, so they didn't like what he had to say in his book. That has happened, but that has not gone on in Britain, and it hasn't gone on in the United States until now. So again, Tucker Carlson is buying into, unwittingly, the left's narrative regarding the West, that the West was actually really quite wicked. We were the bad guys in World War II, not the Germans, not Japan. And the Cold War even goes on to suggest in their discussion here that Stalin, maybe he wasn't the guy that we've all been told that he was. What, a genocidal maniac? Yes, he was. He was that guy. But the danger here is that someone like Candace Owens, as I pointed out in a previous podcast, she went and watched a BBC documentary called A Savage Peace. And it's like it uprooted her whole worldview. Either that or it gave justification to what she already wanted to believe. Now, that particular documentary has a lot of things in it that are true, that are good, but it's also devious at several points, and she lacks the education to recognize it. Carlson has gone and read a book or two related to this topic, and it seems to have uprooted his whole worldview. And by the way, I haven't missed the fact that Candace Owens is egging Carlson on in all of this. She is loving this. Now, she is an anti-Semite. You need to go and watch my previous podcast where I demonstrate this. Carlson isn't. I just think he doesn't know any better. And I'll add to this, the discovery for many people throughout the world, but particularly in the Western world, that the federal government has, in a sense, conspired against the American people as it relates to COVID and lockdowns and forced vaccinations, open borders, election rigging. That discovery for people who naively trusted and believed their government, which many Americans have, has unsettled them to such a degree that now they're going and questioning absolutely everything. That's okay. But it need not unhinge you. And that discovery has so unsettled Carlson that now he's taking the minority view on every major historical event. The Kennedy assassination, space aliens, Russia, Germany, Stalin. He's now taking the minority view on these things. Some years ago, I had dinner with a Yale historian by the name of Richard Rosenfeld. We'll put that image on the book, of his book on the screen. The book is called American Aurora. American Aurora. Now, look at the claims that the cover, the dust jacket, makes for this. 200 years ago, it says, a Philadelphia newspaper claimed George Washington wasn't the father of the country. It claimed John Adams really wanted to be king. Its editors were arrested by the federal government. One editor died awaiting trial. The story of this newspaper is the story of America, American Aurora, by Yale historian Richard Rosenfeld. Now, this book's sold, I think, quite a few copies. Now, why did it sell quite a few copies? This is a book, by the way, that is questioning, undermining the narrative concerning the founding of the United States. Nobody suppressed this book. It sold lots of copies. Rosenfeld was doing loads of interviews all over the place. This is a narrative that the left would love. But the reason it got so much traction is because of its outrageous claims. It was taking the minority view. It was basically saying that the founding fathers were just a bunch of criminals or blunderers. Rosenfeld's primary source for these claims was the colonial newspaper, the National Enquirer of the time, the Aurora, hence the title of the book. The Aurora. It would be like writing a history of America using the National Enquirer as your source 200 years from now. It's not a very good source. It's not an authoritative source, but it would be considered a primary document. Do you begin to see the problem? It's not a credible source. It's not the way you go about writing history. And these are the kinds of things that Cooper is doing throughout this particular interview. Now, another thing that Cooper says that might be helpful for you as you think about these kind of issues and the way we arrive at truth is he says at this point in the interview that distance gives us a kind of clarity in understanding history. Let's listen.
That over the next couple decades, like we're going to get to a point where the interwar period and the Second World War are far enough away that people can actually start taking a more honest look at everything that went on. And it is going to be the most fruitful place that any aspiring historian can dive into, because we've spent the last 70 years, I mean, in Europe's case, like literally throwing people in jail for looking into the wrong corners, right? So
that's a claim that historians frequently make. As we go through life, the years bring us wisdom, experience, and memories we hold dear. Yet with age, our health often faces new challenges. It's a natural part of life, but it's crucial to address these changes with the right care and attention. For me, one of the ways to stay sharp is to supplement. I've been using Liver Health Formula, and I recommend you try it for yourself to see the results that it can bring. And right now, I think is the time to start taking care of your liver, because there is a silent epidemic affecting 100 million Americans. 1 in 3 Americans suffer from an overworked and sluggish liver. It affects our weight, energy levels, clear thinking and productivity, and even sleep. Our livers get bombed every day with GMOs, microplastics, toxins, and all of the stuff that you might not even know about. Liver Health Formula can support your liver to minimize the impacts of all of this. It is a premium supplement designed with 11 clinically proven botanicals to support and detoxify your liver, helping you feel revitalized and ready to conquer each day. Just listen to Mr. Harrington's testimonial, who shared his transformative journey. At first, I was skeptical, but the health improvement has been nothing but amazing. The tired, foggy feeling I've had is gone. I have more energy for a longer duration. Also, the service and delivery is always prompt. Of course, results are not typical, thus you have to see for yourself. There's an exclusive deal for my audience. Head to getliverhelp.com/Larry. And as a special offer, you'll get a free 1-month supply of nano-powered omega-3s with your order. That's getliverhelp.com/Larry. Cooper's not the first one to make this claim that distance from a historical event offers us perspective. And I think that academics love to say that. I've heard that said many times, and I think even I, at some point when I was younger and more naive, probably said it too, because I've heard it so many times, is because it lends authority to their own books. If I write a book 60 years after the fact, someone might say, well, do you have really access to, witnesses and such? But I can claim, well, it's more authoritative because we have perspective the further we get from an event. And Cooper here claims that, 80 years isn't enough because you're still not allowed to question these things, even though he's questioning them on one of the most popular podcasts in the world. Distance doesn't always give us perspective. We lose access to eyewitnesses. We lose access to primary source material. Sometimes we lose some of the passion, and this is part of Cooper's methodology that I find so objectionable. Again, he likes to, if you watch the entire interview, and I would encourage you to do so, go ahead and give him a click and listen to it and decide for yourself. But Cooper prides himself in having this kind of dispassionate view that he gets in the heads of the people on the other side of the issue. I don't find this to be a particularly effective way of writing history, because it somehow is suggesting that having a passionate view on a topic like World War II, like the Holocaust, like, let's say, 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, you name the event, January 6th, that somehow that's not credible because it's emotionally charged. There is a difference, ladies and gentlemen, between objectivity and bias, at least is the way I would like to make a distinction for you. Cooper seems to think that approaching a topic without an opinion is objectivity. That's not objectivity. If you study the Holocaust and you don't come away with an opinion, you're an idiot. You see, I can study the Holocaust and have the bias, the view that it was evil, but still approach the material, the factual evidence, with objectivity. That is to say, that I will carefully consider the arguments or the evidence itself. But I will arrive at an opinion. I will have an opinion. And there are certain things that having an opinion, a morally charged, passionate opinion, I think is a prerequisite, or there's something wrong with you. The way that the Holocaust is being discussed here, I've met Holocaust survivors. I have interviewed them. In 2001, I was awarded a kind of Fulbright for educators, teachers of history, that sent me to Europe to study the origins of the Holocaust, this very topic. And since then, I have, of course, been in Europe many times and been to many of these concentration camps. I've been to Auschwitz more than once. I've been to Mittelbau Dora, Buchenwald, Dachau multiple times, Mauthausen, numerous museums, documentary evidence. I have looked at this subject very carefully. And then you listen to, and some of the camps, by the way, the guides are themselves survivors. These days, there are very few of them left because of how distant we are from the events. But I would want to see a guy like Cooper make these kinds of claims to a Holocaust survivor. One of the things that we do in historical scholarship is this, that you're looking for patterns when you're talking about a major event where there were multiple witnesses. So let's say, for instance, Pearl Harbor. Years ago, I was teaching a course on historical methodology at a university, and we were interviewing Pearl Harbor survivors. And what you're looking for in that is commonalities, similarities in the stories. And what you find with events like that, and again, 9/11 would be another event, January 6th might be, you name it, the D-Day landings, is that it's almost like each person's story is on a transparency, you know, the old overhead projectors, and you can lay them on top of each other, and the outlines are the same while having unique outlines. So, for instance, a witness to Pearl Harbor, he might have been on the Arizona and not on the dock, but his description of the day and of the battle, with some variation of his own particular experience, that they're the same. They're all telling the same story, and they're not people who've ever met each other. That's the case with the Holocaust. Alexander Weisberg, in his book called Witness, I think, Weisberg was a communist. He was a physicist. I think he was involved in helping the Soviets build their atomic bomb. Escaped to the West, wrote this particular book. No, excuse me, I think the book is called The Accused. I think it's called The Accused. I didn't think it's a great book, but there's this gem of a line in it, and it is this: history gives one weapon to truth, which it denies to the lie. Lies have many versions. Truth has only one. Lies have many versions. Truth has only one. When you interview Holocaust survivors who've never met each other, they're from different countries. One's family was rounded up in France and sent to Buchenwald, another in the Netherlands and sent to Sachsenhausen, another in Poland and sent to Auschwitz. But the transparencies begin to line up. Now, how is it that hundreds of thousands of people who've never met are in on such an extraordinary conspiracy to lie and to make all this stuff up? As someone said on social media brilliantly, I don't recall the Germans denying the Holocaust at Nuremberg, and they did not. Indeed, it was their own documentary evidence that largely was used to condemn them for the events. So we know that it happened. But you see, just as with the American Aurora, historians like Cooper, they like to build an entire narrative around a scurrilous source. They focus on one little sliver and they build their narrative. They build their story. And then, of course, they sell books and they get on big podcasts like Tucker Carlson's. That's the way they go about doing it. That's the way these kinds of claims are made. And I think that's pretty important as it relates to this. Now, again, what I'm wanting you to understand as it relates to this particular issue is I'm hoping that you will be very thoughtful listeners. And I want to end with this because the reason that Cooper gets away with this is because he speaks with authority. He speaks with authority. And let me illustrate for you, or rather, let me let a very interesting public speaker, a man by the name of, what is his name? Muhammad Khatani, who won a competition for public speaking, Toastmasters. Let's listen to what this guy says right here.
What? Oh, you all think smoking kills? Let me tell you something. Do you know that the amount of people dying from diabetes are 3 times as many people dying from smoking? Yet if I pulled a Snicker bar, nobody would say anything. Do you know that the leading cause of lung cancer is not actually a cigarette? It's your DNA. You could smoke for years and nothing will ever happen to you. This whole war against smoking is just to restrict the farming of tobacco. Mr. Contest Chair, fellow Toastmasters and guests, I use these arguments, even though I just made them up, with a group of my friends, and the results, 5 of them believed what I said. 2 of them started smoking. Words, when said and articulated in the right way, can change someone's mind. They can alter someone's belief.
So do you see what he did right there? He's showing you how an individual who, using the right words and speaking with authority and spouting data, can often carry the day and convince loads of people of something that is true when it's utterly false. That's what Cooper does in this podcast. He's getting away with it. He's convincing, he's swaying his audience and Tucker Carlson himself because he's speaking authoritatively, speaks of his mountains of research, even though he's making outlandish claims that he can in no way support. We will now go to my friend, we'll bring on the show, Paul Reid. I'm delighted to be joined on the show now by my good friend, historian Paul Reid, who is the co-author with William Manchester of the blockbuster, wonderful Churchill biography trilogy, The Last Lion. If you haven't read it, I strongly encourage you to read it. I have it right here on my desk. And Paul, I think you're joining us from North Carolina. How are you?
I'm fine, Larry, and thank you for those kind words. And it's great to be chatting with you again.
Well, it seems to me, Paul, that you are the go-to guy, or certainly one of them, when it comes to the kind of claims that we are hearing in this podcast by Daryl Cooper, who is saying, among many other things, that Churchill was the chief villain of World War II, that he was a psychopath, that he was chiefly driven to become some kind of warlord and hero and redeem himself for the failures of Gallipoli in the First World War. Paul, I know you've listened to this interview. What's your knee-jerk reaction to these kinds of claims?
I don't know if I'd call it knee-jerk, because I actually listened carefully, went back, listened again to certain phrases, sentences, paragraphs, and I came away thinking, goodness gracious, this guy is on a platform with millions of users, Tucker's show, and he is saying A and B and C and D and E and F and G with no factual support. I mean, I don't expect him to sound like an academic and cite this primary source or that primary source. He's just sort of prattling on. And if I didn't know what I know, I'd be listening to him saying, oh my goodness, I never knew that Churchill was a psychopath. Oh, wow, I've got to go out and tell my friends. And I didn't know he played with little toy soldiers and got mad if people interrupted him. I don't know where Cooper got that, but you've seen photos of the British war rooms where people are moving battleships, little miniature ships around, and U-boats and army groups. That's what Churchill was doing. I have no reference by anyone who knew him during the war that he was playing with little toy soldiers and got mad when he was interrupted. So simply falsity after twisted, semi-factual truth, and it makes the podcast an accessory after the fact to this bad information that Cooper is spewing. Tucker becomes the wheelman, during the robbery.
Well said, Paul. Let's begin with this claim, and I quote. This is from Daryl Cooper. According to Tucker, the best and most honest popular historian in the United States. Cooper says this: Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War.
Well, he went on after that to explain why that was so, and everything he said, as far as I can tell, as far as the Germans dropped leaflets saying, please, we don't want the British Empire to disappear. We want you to be strong and free and help bolster the strength of Europe. All incorrect. They were dropping bombs from the get-go. From the day after Dunkirk, they were strafing airports. They resisted bombing London until they didn't. A couple of months later, they started the Blitz. So how Churchill could be a villain when he wasn't even in office when Germany and Russia invaded and divided Poland in 1939, Churchill was over at the Admiralty, and he had just been reappointed there. So Churchill as a villain in the Second World War is somewhat analogous to Bismarck somehow being a villain in the American Civil War, just apples and oranges.
Yeah, it's quite a claim. And just speaking as a historian, Paul, when you were writing this volume here, the third volume of the Last Lion Churchill biography trilogy, available on Amazon and at fine bookstores everywhere. Let's say you, during your research, come across an extraordinary claim about Churchill, one that interests you, that might be relevant if true. How do you determine whether you include it in your biography or not? I mean, what is the task of the historian in a situation like that?
Well, I think it goes back to my newspaper reporting days, and to what we all learned in high school classes and how to write a term paper. If it's newsworthy, if it's relevant, it's got to go in. Otherwise, you're sculpting your own statue of Churchill or whatever the subject is, and you're doing it subjectively. Now, everyone brings subjectivity to everything, and so you've got to put yourself under the microscope or scrutinize yourself when you decide to put something in or leave something out. And I found early on, go talk to the experts, because there is this school of thought, and William Manchester subscribed to it, that Churchill was a lifelong depressive, for example. So I spoke to 4 psychiatrists, including the head of the Veterans Administration psychiatric unit, and I gave them a blind test. I said, here's a patient or a person, and these are his behaviors over a long period of time. Is this the sign of a lifelong depressive? And all 4 of them said no. This person is having normal, brief episodes of down, bad hair day that we all have. And then they all asked, who is this person? I said, Winston Churchill. And, so that, and I went with that. That was my take after doing some work, not just knee-jerking saying, hey, he's not a depressive. Same with his alcohol use. He did drink a heck of a lot from morning to night, but he wasn't a drunkard. He could metabolize it somehow, miraculously. From age 20 to 90, he had a bottle of champagne for lunch every day, and then cocktails, and then more cocktails, and more champagne. Was he a functioning alcoholic? I don't really know. I just wanted to get out there what his drinking habits were and let the reader decide for himself or herself.
What do you make of the claim that he was a psychopath?
The claim that Churchill was a psychopath is, my short answer is quite insane. But according to the definitions of psychopath, if we, did some homework as studious listeners and then did some homework on Churchill, you'd have to conclude, no, he's not a psychopath. It's a scientific, psychological, diagnosable condition. And when Mr. Cooper just throws that out, he obviously didn't do his homework. I don't know what doctors he spoke to. And then he never gives 1 or 2 or 3 examples where the listener could say, oh, yes, that's psychopathic behavior. I could see Ted Bundy doing that. He just throws it out there, sees it, to see if it sticks to the wall. Psychopath. Chief villain of World War II. Tucker, please do your job and put him on the carpet and say, tell me how. But that didn't happen.
No, not at any point in the interview did it happen. Cooper also, maybe the most outrageous claim is that which is related to the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust itself is never mentioned by name, and his defenders, when I have gone on social media and said this is an attempt to undermine the Holocaust, they reply by saying, well, show me where, show me the timestamp where he denies the Holocaust. Well, he's too clever for that. He never says that. Instead, he infers that it was all just a big logistical accident, that they went into the East and, my heavens, they suddenly find themselves with millions of civilian and POW prisoners, and they just couldn't feed them. And they thought that it was more humane to put them down like dogs. How do you react to that, Paul?
Well, again, as far as analyzing the social media and podcasters or talk show hosts' responsibilities, Tucker should have been all over that. Tucker should have had a briefing session with someone or himself with background information, at which point he would have said, well, Mr. Cooper, the plan since Mein Kampf was published 2 decades earlier was always to go into the East and always to steal the food, which meant always to starve people to death or kill them if they got in the way, period. And Churchill sent a copy of Mein Kampf to Stalin in 1940 saying, Hitler is going to go in your direction next. And Stalin, who was Hitler's partner, said, oh, no. It was all laid out by Hitler and the Nazis for 20 years. And on the day they crossed the Russian frontier in the summer of 1941, with them went their death squads with trucks and machine guns, and they would put prisoners in the trucks and work the exhaust hose, into the truck and gas them to death or shoot them right from the get-go. There was no, oh my goodness, what are we going to do with all these millions of people? Right from the get-go, they were going to kill them, and they did. And Cooper, very cleverly, that's his explanation for the Holocaust, that, goodness gracious, among those millions of people were millions of Jews who, but they would have been killed anyway. That's what Cooper is saying. No, and no.
Well, the claim also, Paul, that he wanted peace with Churchill. Well, there is some amount of truth to that, because he did not want to fight the Schlieffen, the Alfred von Schlieffen, the chief of the German general staff, who spoke of how you can't fight a two-front war. I mean, the nightmare of Germany was fighting a two-front war, and Germany had fought a two-front war in the First World War, and the result was they lost. So Hitler, knowing this, he wants to delay action on one front while he fights a war on the second, and then he can turn his attention back to Britain at some later date. But again, I found it incredible that Cooper is presenting Hitler as this, almost as a reasonable statesman who never wanted war at all. It just was an accident that everything happened. And then when he says that Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War, he says it in this context. He says, well, at least he was, in terms of it becoming more than an invasion of Poland. It's as if Poland doesn't matter. It's as if that was not a significant event. And it had already been more than Poland. It had been Austria. It had been Czechoslovakia. It had been the Sudetenland, the Rhineland. I mean, it had already been a great deal more than Poland. But somehow this was all Churchill's fault.
Well, Cooper didn't say anything along the lines of what you just said. He did say something to the effect that Churchill and his group were making fun of and denigrating the appeasers who had only tried to make peace in Europe, Chamberlain and that crowd. He didn't mention all of the places you just did, where first he bit off the Sudetenland, and then 6 months later Czechoslovakia, or half of it, and then all of it in Austria, 1938. So the invasion of Poland was like, okay, we've given him 6, 7, 8 chances. It's on now, which Mr. Cooper doesn't go down that route. He just ignores the historical facts. And he says specifically, I'm not quoting, that Churchill wanted the U.S. and the Russians to fight the war. He knew he couldn't win it. That's true. In order to preserve the British Empire and blah, 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 blah. And that's why he's the chief villain. He orchestrated it. It would have been over in October of 39 with Poland divided had Churchill only been a reasonable person. Well, it wouldn't have been over, as you just said, because once Hitler took care of the East, he was going to turn to the West. And that's a what if, that's a hypothetical, but it's there in his writings and his plannings and his exhortations to his generals. First Russia, then the West. By May of 1940, it was, let's do both.
Yeah, it certainly was. And Paul, just thinking of, there is a kind of a mythology that surrounds Winston Churchill. There's no question about that. And he has been lionized. He is my grandfather. He was a great hero to my grandfather and to many people, and remains so to others. Thinking of this and thinking of the hero status that surrounds Winston Churchill, is it overblown? Is it some kind of state religion, as Cooper says, that is imposed on the rest of us, or are there some reasons for it?
No, I disagree there with Mr. Cooper in the sense that there is an imposition in various societies. You know, we have George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, honorary American citizen, half American by birth. And then if someone is curious, young or old, you know, they might read a biography of Churchill. And they might come away with questions and read another one and read a history and then a military history of World War II and form their own opinion, which might be slightly amiss from the sainthood Churchill, but they've done some work. And Mr. Cooper forgot to mention, among other things, Churchill was a historian. Just over a century before Hitler had his invasion barges ready to go, so did Napoleon. So Cooper talks about Germany feeling threatened for generations by the East and the West and invasions. And, well, so did England. The Spanish Armada lived on in memory. And Churchill was steeped in that tradition. And, by the way, Adolf, your invasion barges are across the channel ready to go. So he didn't prompt Hitler to more bad behavior. He was doing what he was elected to do, and that is to protect the island.
Yes, exactly. And the fact that there is a hero status, surrounding Winston Churchill, I think for good reason, doesn't mean that he wasn't a man who was deeply flawed like the rest of us. He certainly was. And his status in the West, I think, has been justly earned. But I think if you read an honest history, yours, for example, William Manchester's, Paul Johnson's, Martin Gilbert's, yep, all excellent. They show the flaws of the man. And the way that it was presented in this particular podcast is Carlson accepts the notion that somehow Winston Churchill's iconic status is one that's being imposed upon us from above. That is to say, from government itself, that it's a lie that's being pressed upon us. And I thought that was a pretty extraordinary claim. Adding to that Cooper was claiming, while on a podcast that millions of people have listened to, that these are things you cannot talk about.
Right. While he's talking about them.
I mean, who's stopping him from talking about this? There are all kinds of, outlandish claims that are made, books that are critical of the American narrative, of Winston Churchill, so on and so forth. No one is preventing anyone from talking about that. I don't know what, I don't know. That claim to me is extraordinary when you are on a podcast that is one of the most popular podcasts in the world. Tucker Carlson, I think what's harder is to have Paul Reid on Tucker Carlson's podcast to say the things that most people already accept as true. That's not a good podcast. They want to have somebody on who claims that, Lincoln was a cross-dresser.
Exactly. I mean, it's monetarized. I love the capitalist system and the profit motive, but by Tucker putting Cooper on, more clicks, more advertising, more money. That's the American way. That's great. That's fine. There comes a point where you need some sort of academic honesty and objectivity and truth with a capital T. And if you're monetarizing to lie, then I've got a problem with that. I'm not going to censor you, but I've got a problem with it.
Yeah, it means it's fair game for us to criticize and for us to question. A final question for you, Paul. Why does this matter? There would be some who would be listening to us and say this is some sort of, esoteric academic discussion about things long, in the past. Who cares?
Well, I'd say it matters in the sense that maybe everyone should go out and reread 1984, because imagine if, now Tucker has an audience of millions, and he's got power in that sense. But imagine if he was the state. I mean, this is one guy in a studio duping people, but it could be, the Department of Truth and Information a la Orwell. So it's worth it to pay attention and to ponder, what does this mean? And it means we got to be studious and careful, skeptical, sometimes cynical. But we got to, keep studying everything, weigh everything you see and hear as best you can, and then hope for the best.
Well, Paul, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today. We got to get you down here, get you live here in studio to discuss Winston Churchill in more depth and enjoy a cigar together.
Absolutely, Larry. It's 5.5 hours from here to your house.
Well, we look forward to it. Take care, my friend.
You too. Take care, Larry.
I hope you found this episode of Ideas Have Consequences insightful. I want to leave you again with this line from Alexander Weisberg. History gives one weapon to truth, which it denies to the lie. Lies have many versions. Truth has only one. This has been Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.